Hi, it's Grant Bailey from Enable Deposit Solutions. This morning I'm with Dominic Cavagnino from Binary Property. Dominic, you're the head of research at Binary Property. So the reason I've got you in today is to talk about the Perth property market, and in particular how it's looking for 2025 and from an investor perspective, obviously beyond that. So I think Perth is the Western Australian property market. It's got 2 million people out of a population of 3 million. How's it performed recently in recent times?
Yeah, it's been Perth's been a market that's obviously always speculated upon because it's very much reliant on that mining sector, and that has previously driven its strongest periods. In the last couple of years, Perth's probably been the strongest market around the country. I know that last year the average dwelling price increased like 25%, which was above most other capital cities. So Perth's been really strong in that regard. Obviously, with any market, there's different pockets and different markets within that.
Markets.
Yeah, correct. So you'll see varying performance, but largely and broadly speaking, Perth's been really, really strong. I think in the last 3 or 4 years, it's been the strongest market in the entire country.
Yeah, 70 odd percent growth, which is the best in the market.
Yeah. So yeah, it's been going really strong, basically. Yeah.
Okay. And when you say it's going strong, there's certainly, as you say, there's markets within markets. Like any market, there's no such thing as the Australian property market in a sense.
Yeah.
There's no such thing as the Perth property market. You can generalize, but I suppose the thing with the Perth market I noticed is that to build a house over there, the average build cost to build a freestanding house is about $350,000.
Yeah.
So, which is a lot cheaper than what you can get something built in the eastern states.
Yep.
But that's obviously not in, I'd say, it's just a 5 kilometre radius of the CBD, Perth CBD. So the attractiveness, I suppose, with Perth from an investor's perspective is that lower entry point.
Yeah.
When the land costs are cheap and also the build costs are cheaper. The average dwelling price in Perth's up around that 800,000 mark, I think.
Yeah.
But what's the investor entry level in the Perth market?
This is kind of the thing with Perth, and that's actually one of the reasons why I'm probably a little bit concerned with that market. The Perth market in the last couple of years has been really strong, but very much underpinned by investor demand. And as you mentioned, that low entry point has really been the attraction for a lot of people. You know, there's not many places around the country, and particularly on the East Coast, where you can still buy a freestanding new house for $500,000 or $600,000. The issue with that is, as you say, the dwelling prices are up around that sort of 800 and house prices up around that sort of $900,000 mark. So if you're spending $500,000, where are you sort of purchasing? And what we're sort of seeing is that a lot of those new builds that are offering those sort of low entry point prices are up, 30, 40 kilometers out of the city. And they're in locations where, if you speak to the Perth locals, it's not really the locations where an owner occupier sort of strives to live in. No. So a lot of these new developments are being predominantly bought by investors from the East Coast seeking that low entry point because rates are much higher and all those types of things. But the dwellings themselves, I've found that a lot of them can actually be quite compromised. Like I was looking at one the other day, it was a 188 square meter block of land with a 121 square meter home on it. Now, smaller block of lands are acceptable when you're buying, in the Paddingtons of Sydney and the sort of very infill kind of pockets. But when you go 40 kilometers out of a city like Perth, those don't have the same appeal. Right? Correct. That's why you're going there. So I don't necessarily think that the investors in Perth are necessarily buying the right types of properties, in the majority of them anyway.
So in any investment, whether it's shares or property, you're going to look at capital growth on what you purchase for.
Yeah.
And then you also want some cash flow out of it, whether that's dividends from shares or you want rental return.
Yeah.
So what's the rental side of it in terms of your cash flow out of it in the Perth market? What's that been looking like?
Yeah, it's quite strong. I mean, the rental returns in Perth, particularly in those outer areas that I just mentioned, at the moment are proving to be really strong and part of the attraction, I think, because naturally as rates have risen, holding costs of an investment property have increased. So finding a property where you can get that higher rental return is quite important. So in Perth, the vacancy rate across the city now is under 1%, which is really strong. The concern, though, is that in previous cycles, Perth's vacancy rate has jumped up to sort of 6%, which is something you don't often see across a capital city. And that obviously comes back probably to its reliance on sort of the mining sector and the volatility of a sector like that. So right now, Perth market from a rental point of view quite strong, probably averaging 5.5% rental returns in a lot of cases, which are not really available on the East Coast at the moment, I would say.
Sure.
But where my concerns lie is probably around where people are achieving those, masking some of the potential risks around investments and kind of, maybe they're going to get the rental return, but not so much see the capital growth because of the locations that they're purchasing in.
So the downside moving forward in Perth is potentially with the rental returns as vacancies might go up, they might go up. So that might impact your return, but also you seem to be suggesting that the capital growth, given that they're in certain areas where a lot of these interstate investors are buying, people aren't going to necessarily see the greater potential for capital growth in there.
Yeah, I think, Perth's been really strong, right? And if you've bought in Perth in the last few years, you've done quite well. However, the fact that it's done so well, it's probably at the top end of its sort of cycle.
So it's had its run in some respect.
Yeah, and naturally when you're buying at the top end of the cycle, you do increase the likelihood of potentially seeing a more stagnant kind of period.
Right.
So, I probably feel that Perth has sort of gotten to a point where a lot of its growth has been exhausted. It doesn't necessarily have the same fundamentals as some other cities. Although interstate migration has been stronger relative to where it was previously, it's still not up at the same levels of Queensland, as an example, on the eastern seaboard. So I just think that, whilst 45% of the total city's sort of economic output still relies on mining, if that was to fall away or if there was some changes to that, based on demand from overseas countries and so forth, it does mean Perth is probably a bit more of a risky investment. So, when you combine a few things like buying at the top end of a cycle, buying in a market that is a little bit more one-dimensional than others, buying in the outskirts of that market, buying where a lot of investors are buying, that kind of is a few of the key attributes that generally lead to sort of lack of performance, I suppose. Yeah.
So for 2025, for predicting what you think is going to happen in the Perth market for 2025, do you think that the growth that's been experienced there over the last 4 or 5 years is going to plateau?
I think it might slow down. It might still see a reasonably strong 2025, but I think it's definitely nearing the top. I don't think we're going to see the same levels of sort of what we've seen in the last 12 months. Obviously, there's so many variables that can impact that. If interest rates start to come down and investors start jumping back into the market, maybe it kind of kicks along a little bit further. But all in all, I think the majority of the capital growth in Perth has been experienced, and I think it's probably more likely to plateau than what it is to continue at the strengths it's been going at.
Okay, so personally, because you're not here giving investment advice, but if you're going to put your money into a market, the Perth market, is that something you would do? Look at a 5-year plan, I suppose, because getting into bricks and mortar is not like shares you can get in and out of every other day. But so if you're going to do that as a 5-year investment, is Perth a market that you would?
It's probably not one for me. Yeah, it's probably not one for me. I think I would look at other opportunities. I think there'll still be pockets, the more premium and affluent areas, but unfortunately, I don't think they're the locations that investors are going into. And to get into those areas, you've got to spend, upwards of $1 million kind of thing. So for me, it's probably not a market that I'd be going into at this point in time.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Well, thanks for your time today.
No worries. Thanks,
Dominic.